All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to the West Coast. My name is Mallory Baches, and I want to welcome you to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, and we provide opportunity for the audience to engage with them in real time. So you'll see a Q&A there at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that, and we'll be getting to questions once each of the speakers have spoken. This webinar series is intended to provide a platform for CNU to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing and emerging issues that we're all facing right now. And today's conversation is going to be housing affordability and access. And I'll be introducing the three wonderful speakers that we have in a moment. But before I do, I wanted to go through to point out to y'all that we have a couple upcoming webinars. The first is Equity-Driven Planning with Mitch Silver. He's the Commissioner of New York City Parks Department. That'll be happening on Tuesday, August 25th at 2 p.m. We also have on Tuesday, September 1st at noon Eastern Time, we'll be Bring Back Main Street and Small Scale Manufacturing with Ilana Prus, who is the founder and CEO of Recast City. But today we're talking about housing affordability and access. And well before the current pandemic that we're facing, cities and towns across the country were already enduring a housing crisis. In 2018, the National Low Income Housing Coalition found in a study that the full-time minimum wage workers could not afford housing in any county in the country. And the Charter of the New Urbanism says that we advocate for diverse neighborhoods, but if housing is unaffordable to all but the very wealthy, then are we living up to these ideals with our work? And so today we've brought three wonderful speakers, three wonderful experts in housing affordability, housing access, housing mobility, to discuss their backgrounds and then to engage in a conversation about the topic. I'm going to start here by introducing Laura Foote. Laura is the founder and executive director of NIMBY Action, a network of pro-housing activists fighting for more inclusive housing policies. They have over 3,000 members, and they drive policy change to increase the supply of housing at all levels, bringing down the cost of living in opportunity-rich cities and towns. Laura is a nationally recognized leader in the movement. She helped grow the fledgling pro-housing movement into a political force, and that includes working on legislation at state and local levels and helping to elect housing champions in those positions. Laura is going to talk about a lot of exciting things having to do with particularly the politics associated with this very difficult topic for many communities. Next up, we're going to have Burhan Azim. He is a Pakistani immigrant that grew up in New York City with housing instability and then later moved to the Boston area. Burhan is a board member and treasurer of Abundant Housing Massachusetts and also a board member of A Better Cambridge. Abundant Housing is a statewide NIMBY organization that is working to pass bills like Housing Choice in the state legislature. A Better Cambridge is a NIMBY organization with an affiliated PAC that is focused on Cambridge itself. He holds a Bachelor of Science from MIT, speaks 3 languages, and has studied sustainability and is passionate about migrating climate change and its impacts. And so we're excited to hear from Burhan. And then finally, Katie Swenson is a nationally recognized design leader, researcher, writer, and educator. She's a senior principal at Mass Design Group, a nonprofit architecture firm with the mission to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. She's releasing 2 books this fall. One is Design with Love at Home in America, and also In Bohemia, a memoir of love, loss, and kindness. She's formerly the Vice President of Design and Sustainability at Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national nonprofit. Her work there was in affordable housing, community development, and leadership cultivation specifically. She's a Loeb Fellow, taught at Boston Architectural College and Parsons School of Design. And she's co-authored Growing Urban Habitats, Seeking a New Housing Development Model with William Morrish and Suzanne Schindler. All 3 of these speakers have extensive knowledge, so I'm going to pass off first to Laura to go ahead and begin her presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with, uh, frankly, like most of the time, I end up talking with people who are like intro to the topic and really excited. But I'm assuming that we have a certain level of nerdiness here at the Congress for New Urbanism. So I'm going to, I get the opportunity to sort of skip over some things. Normally, I talk a lot about how we have a housing shortage. And you sort of need to hammer that over and over in people's minds. Like fundamentally we have a housing shortage, and that in and of itself, the lack of sufficient quantity of housing for people to live in is bad, has a disproportionate impact on people of color, has a disproportionate impact on low income people, has a disproportionate impact on younger people. I'm going to take a lot of that as stuff that we kind of understand already. I think that this crowd probably pretty much understands that it's also a drag on the national economy as well as local economies. I'm going to take it as a given that you all understand that it also has a horrific effect on our environment, that we are driving up carbon emissions as people are forced to live further and further from their jobs and opportunity, mega commuting. So we at NIMBY, we kind of categorize the housing shortage as being bad for human beings. We care about them, the economy, also a good thing to care about, and the entire environment. And so we normally we talk, okay, how we're going to address the housing shortage. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? We see it fundamentally as a policy problem. Obviously, we know how to build housing. Obviously, we have market demand. I hate my apartment, so I would like to upgrade to a 2-bedroom. So there's your market demand. We have a lot of available land. There are 2 parking lots on my block. And, you know, we joke a lot, it's not millennials complaining. You know, sometimes there's a pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, you know, oh, you can't afford to live in this community. There's a lot of people have a lot of weird ideas about housing. And so we believe that there are jobs and not enough housing near them, driving high prices and long commutes. We have this fundamental shortage, and that's a shortage that makes both market rate housing unaffordable and also a chronic housing shortage of also subsidized affordable housing. And like, okay, why? What are these policies? We break them into zoning, permitting, and funding shortages. We also often talk about bad incentives that make it hard for cities and towns to say yes to housing. But really fundamentally, why does the zoning and the permitting hold us back from being able to have abundant housing? Housing decisions are being made on the block by block level. They are being made project by project, and they are getting held hostage by people who have the wherewithal and the, you know, local political connections in order to be fundamental to the decision making around those projects. We have this kind of big idea that's starting to get through the population that exclusionary zoning is bad. It's very exciting, right? Donald Trump has come out and said we need to protect the suburbs, and suddenly everybody's talking about how exclusionary zoning is a really bad thing. And it's thrilling for me, right? I'm like, yes, like we're finally connecting the idea that like being inclusive in this, like, oh, my school doesn't technically say no Black children are allowed, but if we keep people of color and low-income people out of our communities through exclusionary zoning, then obviously in practice, that is what is happening. And it's really, we think it's extremely important to understand the history of how we got here. Where did these laws come from? We know that there is a history of segregation, of explicit racial segregation that was government policy, and that really a lot of our zoning maps directly come from that. As soon as we made it illegal on paper to block people of color from communities, we started coming up with elaborate zoning rules that made the, okay, you can't say no Black family can join this neighborhood. Okay, so then we will block the kind of housing that is more accessible and affordable to those people. And we will also therefore be blocking affordable, subsidized affordable housing, because by blocking multifamily housing, in many cases, you are blocking low income and communities of color. I'm gonna assume that you guys, I just went pretty fast through that, but people with a planning background know this, they understand this, And sometimes they will even talk, the president of the APA came out somewhat recently and said, the planning history has been rather complicit in all of this. And they started admitting that the planning profession has actually not always been a force for good in saying we need to integrate our communities. And really fundamentally, that is because of power dynamics. Planners are often employed by local governments where you are under a huge amount of pressure to, you are at the will of the local elected officials. And I really want to help people connect this to like, what is happening now? Because when you start with a pre-segregated society, when you start with the levels of segregation that we have now, and you say local communities should get to decide what their destiny is, and we say we're going to have a decision-making process that prioritizes the views and opinions and, frankly, finances of people who have already gotten the benefit of being able to buy into that community, who maybe historically have been able to benefit from historically racist policies. I'm in Maine right now visiting my family. My great-grandparents were able to buy a home in this town. My grandparents certainly benefited from multiple explicitly racist financing systems that allowed them to purchase homes over the years. My parents' generation has certainly benefited from all of that. I was able as a kid to get into better schools than I otherwise would have because of this multi-generational, systemically racist institution in housing that was designed to build up white families and not families of color. All of that happened, and now we have pre-segregated communities. And the planning and sort of decision-making process is all designed around placating families, frankly, like mine, and saying, how are we going to make you comfortable with the idea of change? And when we make decisions at this level of government, you get just an unbelievable amount of hypocrisy, right? Because of course, my mother's generation doesn't want to say out loud, we don't want those people in my community, right? There are people my generation are starting to have kids, and they say, I want to get my kid into a good school district. And I think we have to say, okay, what is that going to mean? How much of the perpetuating of the existing power dynamics, of the existing segregation, are we going to allow in the name of local control? How much of the existing inequality are we going to allow in the name of neighborhoods deciding what their futures are going to be? How much are we going to allow this entire system where architects and PR firms are spending ungodly amounts of time and money having community meeting after community meeting to convince local privileged residents that the new housing is not going to be so bad, and that maybe it might come with some benefits for them because God knows they need more benefits? We are going to continue to exacerbate inequality if our systems are designed around placating existing residents and not around saying we have to have minimum standards. We have to say there is no major civil rights achievement that has been achieved through local control. It just has not happened. White people and people of privilege do not give it up when it is very close to home. When you are talking about somebody saying out loud, I'm okay with my school integrating, you find that a lot of liberal ideals often erode. And so we have to ask these questions at different levels of government when it is easier to have people, the angels of your better nature, are easier to appeal to when we say, should we integrate schools? I can get almost everyone to say yes to that. Should we integrate our communities? Almost everyone can say yes to that. And so our planning processes have to change in order to get that answer. If we all say we want that answer, then we cannot continue to make decisions on project by project basis where who also gets to come to those meetings is an exercise in privilege. Who has the time, right? All of this process we add on top of it. Once you say, oh, the community isn't happy, so we have to make more process to make them happy, You're in fact selecting for, appealing to the most privileged people who can engage in a process that never ends. My significant other helps build affordable housing, and I can say this story now because last night he got his permits, but 11 years as part of the third attempt at building housing in a fairly privileged neighborhood near a BART station. That's our heavy rail station. This was arguably 50 years in the making to get 1,100 units of housing, which, my goodness, there were a lot of exclamations about that number, but we're finally going to get it. It could have been 2,000 units of housing. We lost units of housing through an 11-year process to make that decision, and we lost time. And so we are seeing that privileged communities are able to both perpetuate the housing shortage and able to keep their neighborhoods fundamentally exclusionary, either by slowing, stalling, or stopping the housing that we know that we need. There is no public engagement process that will get us to an equitable society. It is not going to happen. And I hope that that is a radical enough statement that will get everybody talking about it for a long time to come. I am going to hand it over. I actually have forgotten who I'm handing it over to.
I think I'll take it, Laura.
Okay, great.
So I think that was actually a wonderful setup. We had not planned it that way. But I think that what Laura and I talk about connects a lot. So I'm very grateful to have that. So let me share my slide. See if you can see that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the politics of development at a very granular level. I think Laura did a great job of setting up at a high level and all the difficulties it faced. And I want to kind of go through the process of what happens when you try to build something in a city like Cambridge, Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where I live. And I think it provides a great example. And I think that what's also interesting is that Laura and I can come to slightly different conclusions. I think that like localism is a huge cause of our problems, but I don't think it's going anywhere, at least not in Massachusetts. And so I think that a huge thing that we can fight for is representation, because local elections just are not representative of the cities that they take place in, because voter turnout is so low. It's around 20%, that like the people who vote in local elections are not actually the city. So even plans that are overwhelmingly popular still end up not passing because of who ends up voting. So to take it a step back, let's talk about how your project needs to get approved. And it can either get approved by meeting zoning rules, but oftentimes in Cambridge, these are quite restrictive and hard to build under. So for example, I think around 95% of the parcels in our city are not allowed to be built today. I live on a street of triple deckers, which is currently zoned for single family housing. And so it is so far away from meeting where the city is, nevertheless accompanying a city that can grow. And oftentimes these are also not by right zoning, where it can take an incredibly long process, even if you meet the zoning rules as written. So oftentimes what the developers do is they go through a special permit. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this process as well. This is hopefully just a template to build off of. And so it'll need to get approval from the local zoning or planning board, and that'll need to get voted on by the local city council. And the special corollary here is that in Massachusetts, you can't pass something with simply a majority. You need a super majority. So in a town like Salem, which is right next door, they have 11 members. You need something with 7 members voting for and 4 voting against still will not get passed. You need 8-3 to get something passed. So you need a really big majority to get something passed. And as a result, a lot of things just don't end up happening. And I think this is a great example. Cambridge is a really wonderful city. We have MIT and Harvard, tons of people that want to live here. And over the last 100 years, our population has not changed one bit. Was 105,000, and it is today, according to the 2010 census, 105,000 people. And over that time, the US population has quadrupled. We have gone from about 75 million people to almost 320 million people in the US. And so it's been an incredible change, but our cities have really stayed stagnant. And I think that it is a little bit of NIMBYism in our local politics. You know, those who vote in local elections tend to be older and more privileged, and then there's a status quo bias. I like my city the way it is. I don't want it to change. There's economic interest in that you don't want new housing that's built to make it cheaper for other people to live here because you directly benefit. And there's also segregationist tendencies. You don't hear it directly, as Laura was saying, but you do hear that, I don't want like those type of people in my neighborhood, or that, like I think that the neighborhood is good as we are. We don't want other people coming in, kind of ruin the feel that we have going here. And actually, I think it's a great time when I was canvassing once in some of our richer parts of our city. You really get a sense of how people see the city, in that I was walking around giving out pamphlets, and I went to MIT and I had a bachelor's degree. And the comment I got from almost everyone on the city is, I don't think you're qualified to be talking about housing. See this block? Everyone on this block has a PhD. You can't talk about it unless you have a PhD. So I think that, your advocacy is not really helping here. And I think even things like that you can't be advocating within your own city, that you're not really welcome in this neighborhood unless you have a PhD. Like, it creates a hostile structure, and that really controls a lot of our local politics. And the worst of all are public meetings. So you have to match the bar of the 20% to be involved in local elections. And then you have to match the bar of being the 1% of that to show up to local meetings. There's about 50 people who show up to our regular city council meetings, and they are the ones there every single meeting. And there's the one that speaks. And almost all of the room, myself having been in the room, I'm often the only person who's not white in the room, the only person who's under the age of 50 in the room, and the only person who doesn't own their own home. And so it's like very dramatic experience. And this comes in a city where almost majority minority, and the median age is around 25. And so public meetings are also another step where the city council kind of gets a sense, or the planning board gets a sense of what the city feels, but the people who show up aren't really representative of the community. And there are other structural programs on top of this, not even that include just the city and who represents it. You can easily be sued and have your project delayed, even if it gets approved. So there's lots of affordable housing developments that get approved under local zoning laws, but then they get delayed 5 years because of because of people suing, saying oh, it still doesn't meet this design requirement or that design requirement, and just appealing to the zoning board. And often by that time, affordable housing developers can lose their funding. You also need a supermajority to get bills passed. And I talked a little bit about that before with the example of Salem. We're lucky right now in that in the State House in Massachusetts, we have a bill called Housing Choice that would require that if you're going to pass a bill that increases the housing supply, you can do it with a simple majority, but we'll still see if that's going to get passed. And I think it's just excessive localization, in that it really goes down to you need the approval of not only the city, but also the planning board and also your local neighborhood. And any one of those people, any one of those steps you can get blocked at. And it's made worse because local neighborhood groups are actually officially recognized by the city, so they have official power, even though they end up maybe being a couple neighbors in a very big part of the city with 25,000 people, might only have 3 or 4 people on the committee. So we talk a lot about turnout as our solution. So you see here, there's a graph about turnout, and this is on the 2019 election results. I can let you guess where people who are older and more opposed to housing live. It's around here, and that's where we get really high voter turnout. And a lot of places that are younger, that actually where the housing would get built, because that's where they're on main throughways, people just don't vote. And overall, nowhere in this map does this match the type of turnout you get in national elections, which can be upwards of 60, 70%. And it also goes with the median age of the residents. In the younger parts of the city where you can get median age of 20, 27, in the 30s or 40s, it's a completely different turnout than in the older parts of the city. And I think it just goes to show how older residents are really dominating local politics. I'll have a graph later on that really makes that point home. But we have a solution, which is that turn out younger voters, in that the map of age distribution versus ABC is the group that I'm part of that's pro-housing. You can see that the blue areas where we really win support overlap almost directly with how the median voter age in the cities in the district. And so, where the youngest people are is also where the most pro-housing people are. And so I think that's a solution that we've been going after, rather than combating localism directly. We've been trying to win in our cities by increasing the turnout of younger voters, really anyone under the age of 45. So I think this is a great example. So the blue is a national election in our city. So you see how, this is representative of people who actually end up tending to vote. So we have a very young population, and then we get slightly older, but we have actually pretty high voter turnout. This is in a state election. So this is the overall residents. This is who turns out in the state elections, right? This is the overall residents. Here's who's registered. And actually the turnout is pretty close to this and matches this graph pretty well. And then this is who ends up voting in local elections. You can see who's missing from the population and who ends up not voting at all in local elections. So much so that when you really scale the graphs about what percentage of people turn out, the age group from about 19 to 40, the voting turnout rate is around 20%. Whereas when you get to 60 to 90, you get much closer to 50%, with it peaking at around 65%. And I think that this is the real core, is that and as city youngest Cambridge with 110,000 or 105,000 people, where the median age is around 25 to 30, the most likely people to vote are age 70. Those are the modal voters in our city, and that's where politics appeals to. So why don't younger people get involved? I think it's because part A is that very few people know about their local city council. We have 9 members on our local city council, and I think the latest poll shows about 40% of people can identify who our mayor is, nevertheless, individual city council members. No one knows about zoning. It's quite complex, and it's really hard to get involved. City council meetings are during the workday, and they can be far away, especially if you are a parent with young kids. Our local elections are in odd years, which makes it even more difficult to vote. Most people don't even know there's an election happening. And what's also very tricky is that young people aren't registered to vote, and it can be really hard to register. The Cambridge, Boston area is known for having a lot of students, whether it's college students, but also PhD students, people who've been here for 10 years, and really do want to get involved. But there's a lot of tricky things. You can think you're registered to vote, but for example, if you're a Harvard PhD student who's trying to register to vote, you actually have an address that Harvard gives you. Here's the address you should send your mail to. And if you go and fill that address out on your voter registration form, it will get denied, and the local municipality won't tell you, because what they want is not your mailing address, but your residential address. So let's say you know that and you put in your residential address, you'll still get rejected because they want both. And so oftentimes it can be incredibly difficult to vote, and yet someone will often have to try a couple times. And so it becomes really frustrating for people to vote. And so that's why a lot of time people don't get involved. And so, I think that's a huge reason for why we have a graph that looks like this. I think it's a huge failure of our local politics and who we allow to get involved. But I think that it's also really supportive on how you can get involved. This is the group A Better Cambridge supporting 100% affordable housing overlay. And, whether it's here or I know Minneapolis, and a lot of these smaller cities, it only takes 10, 20 people who get involved and are really excited about changing their city. And a smaller city, still hundreds of thousands of people, if not, millions. And that number of people can really change the politics. The affordable housing overlay will get passed this month, and that's because of A Better Cambridge and how a few dozen volunteers really got involved over the last election and got us the supermajority that we need to pass this law. So that's all I have to say on the topic. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session that goes right afterwards. And I think I'll forward it now to Katie.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful. It's nice to go last because so many great concepts have already come up. I'm going to, let's see, can you all see my screen? Everything working? Good. So hi, so glad to be here. Katie Swenson, I'm with Mass Design Group. Mass is a nonprofit architecture, landscape architecture, design and build firm. We have over 120 participants in our collective, and we have 8 offices around the world right now. I work out of our Boston office, although I'm of course working from home these days, but we have about 80 people in Kigali, Rwanda, our first office. I want to just start just a little bit with the moment that we're in. We have been doing quite a lot of work in understanding the role of architecture in fighting COVID-19. I think we've all experienced profound shifts, and so it's important to just start with some of them. Mass has worked for about a dozen years in designing hospitals and healthcare centers mostly in Rwanda and elsewhere in Africa, where using passive and design strategies to combat the prevention of the spread of either tuberculosis, cholera, Ebola, has been a real design strategy. And so when COVID-19 hit, we got a call first thing Monday morning, March 15th, from Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, asking if we could review plans for the temporary shelters that they were putting up to be able to treat and test their clients. And we started understanding that from the very beginning that architecture and architects had an important role to play in participating in keeping people safe. So we set about doing a series of these resources. They're all available free on our website, essentially applying lessons from infection control to this situation as guidelines and the research and science was developing. One of the most incredible projects we did was being able to walk through the halls of Mount Sinai during a surge with a doctor with a camera, GoPro on his head, understanding what was happening in these incredibly stressful environments. People in the field of infectious disease talk about spaces, staff, systems, and stuff, and the kind of coordinated front of all of these things. And so, of course, you think about systems, staff, and stuff being all the PPE, the protocols, all of the different sort of mechanisms. But understanding how this space can also play a role in supporting keeping people safe was an important element of the conversation that I think has not been as elevated as perhaps it should be. So yesterday, actually, we had a webinar with the Joint Center for Housing on this new guide, Designing Senior Housing for Safe Interaction. I encourage you to go and have a listen and look through this really important scope of work. We chose in the housing arena to specifically focus on senior housing because, of course, seniors are both most vulnerable to the disease and the effects of the disease, but also to the threat of social isolation. And so in our efforts, we're trying to understand how do we design new housing or retrofit existing housing for safe interaction and not social isolation. So I'm not going to go through these too much today, but I encourage you to have a look. And I'm going to briefly show you one project that Mass is designing right now in Brighton, Massachusetts, which was designed before COVID sort of appeared, but had used a methodology that we use at Mass called the Purpose-Built series, which is essentially digging deep into a mission of a nonprofit's project and understanding how design can very specifically fuel a mission. And because To Life in this case had such a strong emphasis on designing for community, we started to create a strategy with extensive community input and building on, in many ways, the campus that was already there to create these kind of small clustered neighborhoods. And this strategy, it works out very well to sort of create pods in a sense. So I just want to, start by saying that the architecture is in no way going to solve affordable housing, but architecture absolutely has to do its job. It has to dig in, understand the science, understand the research, understand the local context, and then sort of deliver on its promise to create buildings and environments that are going to keep people safe. Now, we heard from Laura already a little bit about, the kind of profound crisis of nearly 40 million households burdened by housing expenses. in the US, we've been building 80,000 new units of housing per year, but losing 100,000 units to either gentrification or abandonment, or they were built as affordable units and then kind of get lost into the marketplace. And of course, at this moment in time with COVID, we're all kind of, the affordable housing industry has done an amazing job, I think, trying to go to bat for renters all over the country. But I think we're all incredibly worried about what's going to happen as the economy continues to falter and rents are going to be due. So here we are in this environment. At Mass, we say architecture is never neutral. It either hurts or it heals. And I think I would in some ways say the same thing about sort of our approach towards housing. I think, my colleagues kind of brought up this idea around local control and the fact that we don't really have a federal housing policy. And so, no housing policy is a policy, I would argue. The fact that we do not have a guarantee that every person in America should have access to a home is itself a policy. So I want to share with you, I have this book coming out next month. I'm so excited about it. Got one copy here, but it's into the warehouse. And I'm going to show you a few, I'm going to show you 4 case studies, because part of what the charge I think I heard from Mallory when she asked me to join this conversation was to also understand how housing operates in context as well. So, if we start with certainly the premise that, architects have an absolute mandate to deliver on the very best sort of architecture at a building by building level, I think understanding that, of course, we don't live only in buildings. We live in places and neighborhoods and with people. So my work, let me see, how do I, okay. Sorry, I was getting, wonder if I can go back. Okay, so my work for the last 15 years with the Enterprise Rose Fellowship Program has been an incredibly instructive part of my life. And so this book, Design with Love, is built on this theory that everyone, no matter their race or their neighborhood they live in, deserves a well-designed, affordable home in a safe community. And as I set out on this journey, I was asking myself a couple questions. The first is, can effective community design help overcome the trauma born from years of racism, disinvestment, and neglect? And then I think also just, on a personal level, on an individual level, could I myself learn to recognize the power dynamic of my personal privilege in a way that allows me to contribute to this dismantling of systemic injustice rather than contributing to its perpetuation? I think a difficult and important question. Let's see. Uh-oh. Something's going a little faster than I am. So we started this journey in San Ysidro, California, at the border of Tijuana and San Diego, in a town of 30,000 people. David Flores was a fellow with me when I was a Rose Fellow back in 2001 to 2004. So it's a community that I've gotten to know over many years. This is an image of the new $750 million border control station. In case you haven't been lately, just to be clear, there already is a wall. There are sort of multiple layers of walls at the border. And so David Flores has worked in San Ysidro for nearly 20 years. This first project, La Casitas, was built back in 2004. And as an architect, he also brings his whole self to this endeavor. David himself was born in Juarez, Texas, and born in Mexico and immigrated with his family to the US when he was 9 years old, and his father was later deported and separated from their family. And so this idea that essentially the issues of community development are in so many ways about keeping families intact, both on either side of the border, crossing the border, this kind of constant flow that is really the reality for people in this community who often will wake up in Mexico and go to school in the US, or wake up in the US and go to the doctor in Mexico. So I wanted to just highlight that, of course, housing is an incredibly important part of the equation here, but it's also healthcare, immigration processing, and so many other issues that Casa Familiar is looking at. They've just completed a beautiful project designed by Teddy Cruz called Living Rooms at the Border, which is absolutely fantastic. But the issues of affordability just continue to challenge this community, where because of many of our policies that determine who's eligible for housing according to a kind of area median income, there's a tremendous mismatch between what people are able to afford and what even the affordable market is able to deliver. So, you know, incredible to see the kinds of architects who are taking on just about every aspect of the question. Certainly housing, but also David has served on the Planning Commission of San Isidro. He's also been a part of the planning and trying to advocate for his community as this border control center at San Isidro gets designed and completed. I'm going to move quickly to Thunder Valley, South Dakota, Lakota Sioux community, where a group of young people had an incredible vision to bring forth the sort of cultural heritage of their spiritual life into a built articulation of the present at the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. The reality, however, is that 85% of the homes in this area are flimsy, inefficient structures. And, you know, to the points of my colleagues earlier, I think there's also just this kind of stunning policy and financial, you know, to call it a mismatch is perhaps understated, between a banking system and the needs of people. Lenders won't finance site-built homes on a reservation because the land is owned by the tribe and the bank cannot foreclose on such land. And therefore you see a preponderance of trailers and other sort of HUD-related housing. So here the issues are certainly about housing, but also about language and culture and school. There's a new Montessori school this young boy is walking to with his mom, a Montessori, a Lakota immersion Montessori school on this site. And you see they're also working for food sovereignty and a number of arts and cultures program, as well as economic development. And much of this development was built by a Lakota-owned construction company. So, you know, this idea that absolutely we must build more and better housing, but, you know, just building housing is also not going to solve everything. So moving to Los Angeles, you know, and I think Laura kind of referenced a little bit this kind of incredible situation that we have in the US, where at least 10,000 residents in this neighborhood of Skid Row, who many of whom live outside of shelters and in a kind of environment that has actually been planned. The Los Angeles City Council, you know, about 50 years ago created a containment zone in Skid Row. So this is a neighborhood this is a planned neighborhood. One could argue it wasn't necessarily planned very well. And, you know, I think that it's important to just recognize how much we've gotten kind of used to this idea that homelessness is a thing in America. I think you know, it's amazing, I guess, what you can get used to. But I appreciated this local artist saying that, you know, Skid Row or really the effects of homelessness is the predictable result of a profoundly sick society. And I think it's really important to kind of take that on squarely. Lots of really important, both not just architecture, but attempts at really using design and design with dignity as a way to not just elevate, you know, the role of affordable housing, but kind of celebrate housing for people who were homeless before. I think it's also important, you know, to understand this idea that, you know, sometimes we say like, home is where our heart is, or there's no place like home, etc. This kind of notion that, you know, home defines us in some way, and especially now when we're spending so much time at home. But, you know, this kind of idea that that people who are living in alternative means do not count somehow, or aren't able to vote or aren't able to count, I think is something that we need to really think about. The last project I'm going to show is in Baltimore, Maryland, where to the point earlier about redlining, Baltimore got a jump on redlining with racial segregation governing much of their housing policy starting in 1910, a couple decades before others kind of piled on. And much of the result in this neighborhood on West Saratoga Street in West Baltimore is that a profound disinvestment over many years. Of course, in redlined areas, it's impossible to get a loan for your home or to sell it at a price that would merit the kind of upkeep. And so many of the houses were owned either by slumlords or people who couldn't maintain them, they become abandoned and ultimately get torn down. And what gets left is often sort of a dumping ground in the neighborhood. And, you know, this is also a neighborhood where there's a tremendous amount of gun violence, and this sort of idea that neighborhoods are kind of, I guess, left a little bit on their own to solve their issues. So this man, Donald Quarles, who lives on this block, set out first to stop the dumping and ended up taking on this kind of major initiative to basically make the streets in this neighborhood safe again. And, you know, we like to talk about on the park bench, I noticed was the name of our discussion today, but there's not always a pretty park bench with a shady tree to sit on, you know. Sometimes there's no trees even. Much less a park bench. So Donald set out to make a change in this space where there were some formerly abandoned houses cleared out. It's not even a park, but over time, with his colleagues and partners and neighborhood partners, has, I would say, for the price of one affordable housing unit, built this kind of incredible amenity for the whole neighborhood. And so understanding, again, there's housing on their agenda as well. And I know that we'll get to doing new and renovating affordable housing here, but remembering that, that these public places and spaces we need in all neighborhoods, especially perhaps a neighborhood like this incredible one in West Baltimore. So that's it. I'm going to end there and send it back to you, Mallory, and open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Burhan. Thank you, Laura, for your presentations. And I think, you know, the weaving of these topics, it sort of became effortless amongst y'all. And so I actually have a question to start out with that ties into some of the points each one of you made in different ways, which is to start with, Katie brought up, you know, the importance of home right now for all of us, you know, in a pandemic where we are being asked and or forced or mandated to stay home, literally, that this issue of affordable housing, of housing access, of homelessness is so incredibly it's like a meta concept for us as we sit and talk about the built environment. And so Katie mentioned, in the, I think this is in the preface to your book, Katie, about recognizing the power dynamic of your own personal privilege and affecting and then dismantling these systems, and specifically thinking about the systems that perpetuate the housing crisis. And so I wondered if each of you might reflect a little bit about the ways in which you have found your own work sort of intermingling with the housing crisis in your own local context. Are there ways in which your work sort of takes on a higher level when you look out the front door of your home, or when you look at the immediate neighborhood around you, or in neighborhoods that you frequent, and if that has influenced your work in particular ways, particularly, as I say, right now, while we're so focused on our own homes?
Sure, I can go. So, we all know that the housing shortage has this disproportionate impact on people of color, on younger people, and on people lower income. And for me, that has also intersected with sort of women, and how does that sort of the personal stories that you end up with, where you realize that you think you're hearing a story about somebody's life and challenges they're facing, and then you realize like you're actually hearing a housing story, and you're actually hearing a story that's all about lack of access and opportunity and being stuck. And I worked entry-level sales, especially when I was first out of college, for a while. And, I had a lot of friends where they would tell me they were living with a hoarder. Oh God. And you realize, well, that's a housing shortage story. Or they're living with an ex and they can't get, out of the apartment, and they're living in the living room. And when shelter in place came into effect, is when I really sort of, I had been living with my significant other and didn't move kind of until I had the next boyfriend lined up whose apartment I could move into. And that, that's really fucked up. Are we saying that here? That the feminism in me, I'm exactly where my mother was at my age. I am running a small nonprofit that's doing advocacy. I can't pay myself what I would love to be able to pay myself because we're investing in the movement. And at my age, she was able to get married, buy a house, and have a kid. And at my age, in exactly the same place on paper, I cannot do that. I am stunted. I've put off having kids. I live with a wonderful guy. But for a while, his ex-wife was living in the living room. And I was really glad that shelter in place did not come into effect when she was living in the living room and we were living in the bedroom. Those are the kinds of stories that you end up with, that's a middle-class story at this point. And that is what is also deeply disturbing, that I have told you a middle class story in America that is not that sad. There are far sadder stories than that. And those are classic housing shortage stories.
To build upon that, I think that each person has their individual stories. And I think that there's so many you can count. In Cambridge in general, and then to share my story, in Cambridge, there's so many different stories about if you're young 20 something and you go to graduate school where you might be making $40,000 a year, but the rents here are $3,500 for a 2-bedroom. Most people end up taking 3 or 4 roommates, but also the local zoning laws were meant to punish students such that you can't have more than 3 people who are unrelated live in the same house. So oftentimes they're not even on the lease, and if something happens, such as with one of my friends who was with a predatory landlord who had a triple-decker, and he would only allow tenants, not explicitly saying this, but all of his tenants end up being 20-something white blonde women. And when that started feeling predatory, half of the residents weren't even on the lease, so they had no legal recourse. So there's stories like that, to stories of people who live in larger apartment complexes, such as the one about 10 blocks from me, which saw a 47% rent increase this year. And that's not affordable for anyone. And I know for me, I was born in Pakistan, and when I first came to the United States, like my parents were very poor, and so we lived with another family. But the house was so small; it was a 3-bedroom, and we had 5 of us, and they had 8 of them, and so the 13 of us would live in a 3-bedroom where that was broke all of the zoning laws, and we would hide in the closet when the landlord came because they knew that the one family was there, but having a second family was too much, and we didn't want to get caught. I skipped pre-K because we were afraid of getting caught coming in and out all the time. And so, like housing shortage is a real story that lots of people feel. And like I think what Laura said, it really hits home. It really doesn't have to be this way. Like in Cambridge, the rents have really quadrupled over the last 15 years. Like it didn't always used to be this way, but now it's so hard to imagine a world where it's not this way. But I think that, the advocacy and design shows up like really, it doesn't have to be this way. Like we can do things to change the current situation.
Yeah, I have 3 daughters, and one's a 2020 college grad. So, she's entering sort of this moment in the world, but I'm incredibly lucky to have a home that they could all come home to. And we had a grad student friend come too, and we were able to kind of shelter in place together. Eventually we merged with a family next door who had a 3-year-old and working parents and needed childcare. So I think one of the other big things that's been happening, of course, is, this sort of notion that we work at home and and everything is expected of the home, and including childcare and school and everything else. So for us, we were exceptionally lucky to be able to kind of pod up in a way that we could help each other. So feel very fortunate in that respect.
Well, and another to the broader topic of affordable housing, another privilege that all of us, here speaking and probably many of the people listening in have, is that we, as professionals in one angle or another of this field, we understand the system that is implicating these housing challenges, that is creating the housing crisis. And so I wondered, from you each are operating in different spheres, but I wonder if one or many of you might want to talk about the process for educating people that don't have that sort of knowledge privilege about the system that is creating the challenges that then these people may be facing in their own community. And they may, engage very clearly with the outcomes that they're experiencing, but how do you help them to engage with the process and to build inertia that will change those systems?
Yeah, I'll start. I know you guys have a lot to say on this question, so I'll be quick. I work very closely with a Bronx-based design team called Designing the We, who have an exhibition that's called Undesign the Red Line. And this Undesign the Red Line exhibition does an incredible job of using redlining, which was a very explicit racist set of policies and procedures, but situating it within a much longer time frame, understanding many of the sort of social movements that have kind of created this situation that we see now in our urban environment. So the exhibition has always been in person. And so one of the things that we're starting to try to do together is understand how to kind of digitize that and put that into a larger realm. I think that you can watch a movie like 13th and really kind of grasp so much of certain situations, but how the built environment became the way it is seems to be shockingly elusive for many people, including people who work in banking and mortgage industry and in affordable housing, who simply have not somehow gotten the memo on how our sort of real estate practices have been formed over time.
Yeah, I mean, what I do is wrangle people who are excited about the ideas that we've talked about here and turn them into a real political bloc. and say, okay, we are going to get different people elected, and we are going to move the conversation at the local, state, and federal level. And we do project by project advocacy, mostly as a mechanism to understand and mobilize and change the conversation. So, we do all different levels of advocacy, because when you're sort of taking this new idea and making it part of the political conversation, you have to hit every single level, and get people understanding and thinking about these problems really differently. And so, we've been fairly, medium successful as far as there's a bunch of pro-housing activists across the country, and every presidential candidate on the Democratic side had a relatively better housing platform this year that actually acknowledged the role zoning has played in making communities more exclusionary. That's thrilling. We're seeing real progress in, there's a federal NIMBY Act that is making its way, assuming Congress passes laws again, it's there, and it's plugging along, and I think that there is a real opportunity to make changes at the state, especially level. I think what we will see, and this is common with a real change in society, is that you see local changes, local laws that become poster child for state and federal. And that's good, right? Local change is really important for teeing it up for bigger challenges. But we are not going to achieve, Beverly Hills is not going to say oh, you know what I should do? Get rid of exclusionary zoning, right? That's not going to happen, right? But we could see, Portland just passed major legislation to legalize fourplexes, and it's a great piece of legislation that has the potential to become a real model and a proof of concept for saying, actually, we need federal minimum standards. If we're going to really recommit to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and we're going to make that real, we're going to have to implement zoning standards across the country. We're going to have to actually say we're going to integrate. We're going to have to legalize, affordable housing overlays, where you legalize the construction of actually subsidized affordable housing, but also legalizing simple missing middle, mid-rise apartments in every single neighborhood. And you have to say that, in fact, wealthy exclusionary communities are not going to have the right to keep multifamily housing out. And that's a big change. That's a huge mental hurdle for a lot of people. And we're going to see little, we're going to achieve some local successes, and we're already seeing that. And that builds the momentum for state and federal huge overhauls, which I think are closer than they've ever been before.
I think that was really, really comprehensive on all fronts from Laura. I think that the only additional piece I have is I think if we're talking about individuals who perhaps don't have any experience with zoning, I wanted to just touch on that piece. My biggest thought is that perhaps people who are really active in local politics have very strong NIMBY beliefs, but I'm not sure that regular quote unquote regular people necessarily do. And I think that that's also why I normally start my conversations with that question that I kind of shared with you guys today. It's Cambridge's population 100 years ago was 105,000. What do you think the city's population is today? I think that something like that really gets people thinking, because almost every response is 200,000, 300,000. People intuitively understand that cities are supposed to grow. And around the same lines, if you talk about, the average, the median price today of a one bedroom in Cambridge is $2,500. What do you think it was, when I was born in 1997? And no one will come up with, it was around $500. And it gives you a sense okay, well, actually prices have gone up a lot and the city hasn't changed. And I think just asking those questions where people have an intuitive feel is a really strong way to begin, because I think that getting into the nerdiness of zoning, or affordable housing isn't because of all these market reasons or things like that. A lot of people don't care, or they have a very negative view of the supply demand curve that a lot of us talk about. And so I think just getting a sense of what are the problems, I think is a great way to start a conversation.
And to pile on what Baran's saying, you have sort of the politics is made up of two things, values and trade-offs. And if we say, okay, you know, there are a lot of different ways to ask the question about values, right? Do you think it's important, if you ask the question, like, do you think it's important for a local community to decide what's important for them, right? They'll be like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But, you know, the same person will also give the answer, do you think it's important for your kid to be able to afford to be able to buy a home in your community? Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you think that we should be integrating? Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, there are a lot of questions you'll get a yes answer to, but you have to make sure that it's not intuitive that these values are in conflict. And so you have to make sure that we're saying, okay, we need outcomes of a more equitable society. So we're going to ask the question at the right level of government, rather than having this constant selection bias where people are short-term thinkers and really do not say, you know, it's every individual housing project. It's very easy for every snowflake to not feel like they're part of the avalanche. So, oh, well, how can you say that me blocking this fourplex is causing the housing shortage? This is just 4 units of housing that I hate, right? And so how do we make sure that we're asking the question to the avalanche, not the snowflake?
That's a great way to put it, Laura. I love that. Well, and while we're on this very broad level, and we're a little over 3 o'clock, but I wanted to bring this back because it sort of hit me as like, you know, sort of a key aspect of what we're talking about. Katie brought up that we lack a federal housing policy effectively. And if we, you know, many organizations, not just, you know, folks who work in the planning world who feel that housing is a human right, that the American Bar Association, the UN, you know, there's lots of organizations that would support this as a social position. But if that's the case, what would, it doesn't have to be one thing, but it could just be one particular thing that would be on your dream federal housing policy. What would that look like?
So Obama wrote a white paper one time, and I like almost printed it out and framed it. There are a lot of other things, right, that we can talk about. But I do think that like we could have a federal housing policy, and even we could base it off of laws we've already passed. We have, you know, fair housing laws. We had a policy that was going to say we're going to affirmatively further fair housing. It is, I think, quite telling that previous interpretations of affirmatively furthering fair housing have only addressed the issues of subsidized affordable housing, a key component of fair housing. But I think there's a lot there that's sort of like implicitly racist about saying that fair housing is only about subsidized affordable housing. In fact, fair housing is about all kinds of housing, and is about saying we need our communities to have multiple income levels in the same community. And so there are a lot of ways we could be interpreting current legislation that would actually help us get to a more just society. But also, you know, we could have national zoning standards where, I mean, there is no reason to allow single family home only zoning. If you are going to be allowing housing, there's no environmental reason. I mean, it's the most inefficient kind of housing. It's a mandatory sprawl zone that makes the environment worse, that makes communities less walkable, that makes people lonely. I mean, the other thing is like, I don't know about you, but like every 80s movie was about the suburbs being kind of terrible. And I think that we could just go back to having towns again, right? We used to have towns that would have a little walkable community that weren't about separating everybody out and everybody having a giant lot and being isolated from one another. The suburbs are a commitment to isolation and to loneliness that we just don't have to do as a society. We could say it's legal to build multifamily housing, and yes, individuals might choose to have single family homes, but they might live next door to a 4-unit building where maybe their kid can afford to live, and families don't have to be broken up. And that's something that we could do at a national level.
To talk a little bit about that environmental piece, because I think that's the piece where I can speak on a really technical level. I think that we can't understate the influence that like multifamily units have on the environmental impact of an individual. So an average individual will emit about 138 tons of carbon per year. If you get rid of their cars and like have less driving the way that we do during the peak of the pandemic, it goes down about 12%. If you use less air conditioning, it goes down about 4%. If you like do all of these things, it goes down a couple different, few percent. It's a really, really hard problem to lower someone's individual carbon emissions. If they live, instead of in a single family house, in a triple decker, their emissions go down by about 60%. There is no other initiative that we can take that is so cheap because people are already doing this. The government doesn't have to spend money. It will have such a massive impact on the individual carbon emissions of a person. Like, this is a really, really big deal. Like, there is no way that we can become green or have a net carbon zero policy without having more people live in multifamily houses. It's just not possible.
I agree, absolutely. And I would just add that, you know, in the US, all of our quote affordable housing, all of our subsidized housing, public housing, tax credit housing, vouchers, amounts to less than 5% of our entire housing stock. So, you know, in many European countries, it starts at 20% and goes up to 80%. So less than 5%. And, you know, we talk about housing as being subsidized and, you know, of course we subsidize home ownership for single family homes through the mortgage interest tax deduction. That's you know, 4 times the amount of subsidy we give out in the States are to homeowners as opposed to for affordable housing. So I just think it's also important to just like, yeah, put some of these facts out there. Like less than 5% of the whole country is affordable housing. So it's really, we have a tremendous opportunity to do better.
That's a really great point, Katie. And we're well over, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time and thank all 3 of our panelists so much for this discussion. It was really, really valuable. I learned a lot. Hopefully the listeners did as well. And I want to do a quick plug for the next webinar. The next On the Park Bench we'll be doing on August 25th again at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which will be Equity-Driven Planning with Mitch Silver. And finally, thank you one more time to Laura and to Burhan and to Katie for sharing your knowledge and expertise and engaging in this discussion for us. Thank you so much on behalf of CNU.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you.